Good afternoon. I'm sorry about yesterday's confusion. I had some real technical difficulties and couldn't figure them out. I did eventually figure them out. Yeah, I'm not really sure I figured it out, but I found out what I needed to do to make sure it was right. But by that time, it was well too late. So I decided to offer another audio and video presentation today. We're going to talk tonight about motivating employees specifically. Then we'll move to Human Resource Management, Chapter 11, which is actually talking about finding the right type of employee and then getting that employee and retaining him or her. And then we'll move into talking about union and management issues in Chapter 12. So let's look at the learning objectives for Chapter 10. Explain Taylor's theory of scientific management. We're going to look at the Hawthorne studies and their significance, the levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and try to apply them to employee motivation. Distinguish between the motivators and hygiene factors identified by Hertzberg. Differentiate among theory X, theory Y, and theory Z. Explain the key principles of goal setting, expectancy, reinforcement, and equity theories. Show how managers put motivation theories into action, such as using things like job enrichment, open communication, and job recognition. And finally, show how managers personalize motivation strategies and appeal to employees across the globe and across generations. I want to say to you at the beginning of this chapter that none of us as managers or leaders, but let's talk about leadership or management, however you want to look at that, can actually motivate someone else. The only thing we can do is put the motivation tactics, if you will, in place and hope that the individual employee will embrace them and motivate him or herself. Two types of rewards in motivation. One is intrinsic. That is, as it says on the slide, performance, pride performance, something that you get from yourself, not from others. It's not an outside reward. It's an inside reward. Satisfaction for doing your job well. Extrinsic rewards are something that's given by someone else. They talk about pay raises. They talk about recognition, rewards, and other type things. Pat on the back. If somebody sees that happen, that's a type of motivation. Now, this particular slide talks about fringe benefits, and I'm really not going to go into that at all. We first talk about in motivation Fred Taylor. Frederick W. Taylor, known as the father of scientific management. He developed this in the early part of the 20th century, around 1911 or so, and then he wrote a book about it. What Taylor did was he studied what workers did, made sure that the employer had the right kind of employee to do the job. That means that the employee had the right kind of skills. We still do that today when hiring people. We look for an employee job fit. So we're hiring somebody who has the skills, abilities, and knowledge that fits what is needed for the job. And that's still something that's done today. He also looked at time and motion, how long it took somebody to do something, eliminated unnecessary motion, and then had ways that people did things on the job, and then certain rules. And he said that those should be codified, meaning that they should be written and that everybody understood them. And then this gives you a little bit more of what I just talked about with Taylor. Notice the bottom one was he established a fair level of performance and pay. Not exactly correct. I'll give you an example. One of his famous studies was with a pig hauler by the name of Schmidt. Now, a person who hauls pig is hauling 100 pounds of iron ore at a time. Now, before he put Schmidt to work, following his methods, Schmidt was hauling about 12 and a half tons of pig a day. So Taylor said, you know, you're going to work when I tell you to work, you're going to rest when I tell you to work, and you're going to follow procedures I have set up for this job. So Schmidt increased his performance from about 12.5 tons a day to 47.5 tons a day, almost a four-fold increase. And he increased his salary from $1.15 a day, 1911, to $1.85, a 61% increase in pay. The company, however, realized a 278% increase in his productivity. Is that equal? I don't think so. Taylor was on the side of employees. Many times you hear him denigrated today, but Taylor really was a forward-thinking person. We kind of have to go back and look at what Taylor did and see if what Taylor did is applicable today. Some of it's not. Some of it's kind of breaking jobs down into simplicity, and you know that's like assembly lines and things of that nature. But some of it works. You'd be interested to know, as this slide says, that UPS still follows Taylor's tenets. Notice about things about how to tell a person to get out of the truck, how to hold the keys, what finger to put the key ring on, and things of that nature. It works. One of the reasons that people became angry at Taylor, employers, was because they would implement his procedures, but not completely. They would pick and choose what they liked the best. And Taylor's stuff has to work when you incorporate everything. Nonetheless, Taylor was very important to management and very important to beginning understanding motivating employees. The next thing we get to are the Hawthorne studies. These were conducted by a gentleman by the name of Elton Mayo, who was on the faculty at Harvard University, and some of his associates. And what they did was they did a number of things to determine if conditions caused people to change how they worked. In one, they used a lighting thing, and they kept decreasing the lighting in this particular room until the lighting was similar to moonlight. Now, a little bit different in the 1920s and 1930s than it would be today. We didn't have so many buildings with the lights and things of that nature. And of course, we have more population today. What they found out in this particular experiment and several other ones was that in this experiment, it didn't make any difference how low the light went. Productivity stayed relatively the same, if not increased. What they found out was it was the work atmosphere, the people working together, was the relationships. And so and then they also found out, as the bottom part of this says, people act differently when they know they're being observed. And a very interesting thing. Another one that they did was they changed the work week. Back in the 1920s and 1930s, 6-day work week was expected. That was normal. So they cut it to 5 days a week and automatically expected they would lose 16% of production. 6 into 100 is 16.67. So you lose approximately 16% of your production. That's not what happened. In fact, production actually increased. And the same factors were applied here. People working together. These people had control over what they were doing. They were asked for their input. And of course, we have this thing about people acting differently when they know they're being observed. Some really, really crazy things happened in those days. I mean, they would punish workers and say, one of the things you can't do is use an elevator. I mean, what sense does that make? It doesn't make any. So I would suggest to you to go to Google or another search engine and type in Hawthorne effect or Hawthorne studies. So this was conducted at the Western Electric's Hawthorne plant in Cicero, Illinois, to learn more about what's presented here in the text. The next person we go to about motivation is Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And we'll get to the hierarchy of needs. We'll show you the slide next. And then, of course, this is depicted in your textbook on page 274, figure 10.1. And what Maslow really said was that in motivation, a person won't be motivated or move to the next level of his or her needs until the lower one is satisfied. So he talked about, and this builds up to an apex, as you can see, just like a pyramid. He talked about psychological needs, safety needs, social needs, and then the two higher order needs, esteem needs, and self-actualization. Maslow actually, actually said that people will not ever reach self-actualization because it's something they're always trying to reach. And so, whereas the psychological needs, physiological needs, we're talking about things like food and water and substance and things of that nature. So we know we can be satisfied. A lot of people have complained that they can't replicate what Maslow postulated, that the hierarchy of needs does not follow a strict ladder, if you will, that it's not necessarily always the same. Frederick Hertzberg came up with a different type of motivation, and he told that he said that people are motivated by certain things like the work itself, by responsibility, achievement, recognition, and certain things. And he called that the job content. In other words, what the job itself contained, its tasks, responsibilities, duties, etc. He contrasted that with what he called hygiene factors. And Hertzberg says that these factors are important, but they will not increase motivation. These factors can cause dissatisfaction if, in fact, they're absent. And those things like supervision, working condition, company policies, etc., they will not increase motivation. Those are in the job context, what the job entails, its environment, not what somebody is actually doing. So here's what this just reinforces kind of what I was just saying about the job content. And notice the things that give employees satisfaction. It's within the job. It's a feeling of accomplishment, satisfaction, and things of that nature. The job environment, or job context, if you will, cause dissatisfaction if they're missing, bad working conditions and things like that. But they don't motivate you. They don't make you do or want to do things better and have a higher level of performance. Now, this next slide we're going to look at is, you can find in your text on page 276, figure 10.2, pardon me. And it shows how Maslow's hierarchy of needs correspond to Hertzberg's. And you notice that we have hygiene factors are more or less the bottom three with Maslow. It's like physiological, safety, and social. And then the top two, although he put some other things in here with Hertzberg, show advancement recognition with esteem, which they should be if you stop and think about it. And then self-actualization, achievement, the work itself, and things of that nature. Now, I want to stop here just a second and give you a little bit of information about Hertzberg. Researchers have not been able to replicate Hertzberg's study. One of the reasons, and probably the primary reason they have not been able to do that, is that Hertzberg worked with 200 individuals. His research was done with 200 individuals. And the individuals were either accountants or engineers. Certainly not a random sample of workers that we would find in the employment population. And because those people are different, engineers and accountants, they tend to be very didactic, and they tend to, they use numbers and things of that nature. So the responses are going to be different. However, people have found that there is validity to what Hertzberg said, even though his study cannot be replicated. And it is used, and we'll talk about how some of Hertzberg is used as we move through the rest of this particular chapter. We're going to skip that slide. And we're going to talk now about Douglas McGregor and his theory X and theory Y, which McGregor brought these out in 1960, or around 1960. And this is, again, a motivating thing that he talked about. And what McGregor said is that managers, not the worker, him or herself, or themselves, but managers categorize employees into two areas. Theory X, which says people don't like to work. They have to be coerced to work. The only reason they're going to work is because they're paid. They don't like responsibility. They try to walk away from it. And they have to be punished. Otherwise, threat of punishment, that's the only way you're going to get them to perform. Of course, pay has something to do with that as well. The flip side of that, according to McGregor, is the theory Y manager. And the theory Y manager accepts the premise that people enjoy work just as much as they do play because it's a natural part of life. They like to have goals, and they're committed to goals. They want goals that are challenging, to challenge their ability. They are creative. People are creative. They like to solve problems. And that our intellectual capacity of employees is only partially realized because in many cases they're not challenged. And finally, that it's not just money that motivates people at the job. There are many ways to motivate people at the job, or to put motivation in place to get people to motivate themselves. It's not just money. Now, William Uchi developed and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of what Uchi did, because Uchi believes that theory Z is an amalgam of the type A in the United States and the type J that we find in Japan. Now, don't take this type A to be as opposed to type A and type B. Type A, according to Uchi, is the American manager tends to focus, an employer tends to focus on the individual, where in Japan it tends to focus on organization and groups. Now, one of the reasons I think that Americans, well, let me back this around. One of the reasons that Japan can focus on the organization and the group is that 97% of the people who reside in Japan, maybe it's even a little higher than that, are ethnic Japanese. We don't have 97% ethnic anything in the United States. Even the majority population, the white people, euphemistically referred to and incorrectly referred to as Caucasians, are not 97% ethnic anything. I mean, the Caucasians are made up of French and Italians and Poles and English and German and Spanish and many, many, many other nationalities. And so we don't have that 97%. So it's easy to focus on the organization and a group in Japan. It's a lot easier. Now, that's not meant to denigrate Japan. I don't mean to do that. And I don't want you to think that I am denigrating Japan. I just want you to understand that it's hard to make that comparison. So Uchi came up with what he calls his theory Z. You can find this on graphically displayed in figure 10.4 in your text on page 279. It's kind of a modification, or he calls it a modified American worker. And we can look and see what's in there and take what's good from the Japanese and what's good from the American and try to meld those together. I'm here to tell you, I don't know a whole lot more about Uchi than what I'm giving you right here. and I don't know if it's practiced much in the workplace. I do know that many American companies, as you well know, and some of you may even know better than I, are moving more toward team-oriented work. And that can be good, it can be bad. I think it probably is good. And we found out that there's better ways to do things than by just putting one individual in charge and letting him or her alone. So this theory is there. You can digest it as you want and look at your own workplace and see if something like that is actually being used. And then this particular slide gives you a comparison between theory X, theory Y, and theory Z. And we only want to talk about just that first bullet. X says people don't like to work. Y says that's not true. And then Z said getting employees involved is the key to increased productivity. And I think we all would buy into that. Or if we would buy into it, we should buy into it. Employees like to be asked. There's a concept known as management by walking around. And it simply is going around to employees and kind of ask them what they're doing and how they like what they're doing and what suggestions they might have for improvement and things of that nature. It's amazing what you can find out from an employee when you ask him or her. Most of them are more than willing to talk to you and tell you, hey, you know, boss, I think we could change this or change that or change something else. You know, getting people engaged in work, having them committed to work because they like what they're doing, it really takes you a long way. And if you're in a routine, mundane, humdrum job, it's going to be hard to keep people involved and with it, if you will, about moving things forward. Another theory is we have is known as goal setting theory. And it's simply the boss, supervisor, manager, whatever you want to call that person, pardon me, and his or her employee, and I'm saying that we're not talking about teams here, we're talking about individuals, although this can work for teams as well, getting together and setting goals for the coming year. Now, it can be shorter range than the coming year. It could be like done in quarters or something of that nature. One of the keys to this thing is, and as you can see on the slide, is that the goals are two things. One, that they're challenging, and two, that they're attainable. Now, if they're too easy, the employee probably is not going to pay a lot of attention. Say, oh, you know, I can do this, stand on my head. And he or she might. If it is too difficult and the employee realizes that no matter what he or she does, no matter the resources he or she is given to do the job, he cannot complete it because it's too difficult, he'll just back off. So I have many times used the term moderately challenging. Perhaps I should take the word moderately out, just use challenging, but attainable. And when people see that, they're going to go in. And of course, the other thing about goal setting is the employee has bought into this and said, yeah, I can do it. And he or she helps set the goals. So it's not imposed upon the employee. One of the big goal setting theories, concepts, I think I like to, is known as management by objective. And here the goals are set and the objectives are laid out. And normally speaking, the manager and the employee come back together on a regular basis, normally in a quarter, and they review what's happened, whether the goals have been attained and what they need to do, and maybe they need to be changed, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, there's obviously monitoring of results, and then the employee gets feedback. One of the criticisms of management by objective is there's a lot of paperwork involved. And another criticism is that the objective, the goal, may supersede the goals of the organization. In other words, they become primary, and the goals of the organization become secondary. And of course, that can't be and shouldn't be. This particular slide just gives a little bit of a graphic display of what organization, of what management by objective is. And you can see how it moves. And these are organization objectives, and then linking objectives with the employee to that. Monitor, evaluate, reward, etc. And actually, it goes more in a circle. I think, and I like to think of it in a circle as opposed to a rectangular or a square. This is just a slide that shows some of the companies that use management by objective. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this particular slide. Notice the Toyota Motor Company and things of that nature. Then we moved to expectancy theory. This is a theory came up mostly postulated by a gentleman by the name of Victor Vroom. And it's talked about and then depicted at the top of page 281 in figure 10.6. And notice what goes here. The employee asks a series of questions. Can I do what's expected of me? Am I going to be rewarded? Now, remember, let's think this reward isn't necessarily monetary or something else. It could be the intrinsic value. I'm going to get satisfaction out of mission accomplished, if you will. And then finally, is the reward going to be worth my effort? And so if you look at the figure, we'll move to the figure right here. This is what, and the employee asks those questions. And notice that there are a couple of places here if the employee, when the employee says no to and answering that question, he or she is no longer motivated and will stop. If he or she answers yes to those questions, then they're going to continue with the task, and we know that they're motivated. Now, Nadler and Lawler had some modification on Vroom. And a couple of things that they said here, and I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but what you need to determine if you're trying to motivate somebody is find out if the rewards you offering are valued. And if they're not valued, you have to change the reward system. Employees are not going to do something if they don't value the reward. Obviously, tie rewards to performance, and then make sure that they get what they expect. We have a thing known in motivation as reinforcement. Reinforcement, notice it includes a lot of things, but the primary object of positive reinforcement is to reward behaviors that you want continued. Negative reinforcement is just the reverse. Take that away and let the individual know that that type of behavior is not acceptable. And that way, it won't be repeated. Another theory of motivation is the equity theory. And the equity theory is just really comes down to exactly what the word equity means, or one of its meanings, and that's fairness. And the employee will say to him or herself, okay, I'm doing this many outputs, and my comparison other is doing this many outputs, and yet he or she is rewarded much better than I am. So what's going to happen when I perceive this inequity? I'm going to do several things. I'm going to reduce what I'm doing because I'm not being rewarded for it. I may look for a different comparison, although probably I won't. I may leave the situation, ask for transfer, or anything else. We really have problems down there at the bottom bullet. If we have perceived inequity, we're going to have decreased production, decreased satisfaction, and maybe morale problems beyond just that one individual. One of the ways that and by the way, this is the lecture discussion question, how does Hertzberg how does his theory relate to job enrichment? And you can look at that and tie that in and make sure that you do tie that in and show how the various things within job enrichment tie into Hertzberg and vice versa. Notice that this is called a motivational strategy. I think it's just plain smart. And what it is that you're giving the individual some variety in what he or she does. Let's look at the next slide here. That they can really identify with what they're doing, that what they're doing is significant. There's some autonomy to it, and then they're going to get feedback on what they've done. Now, one of the big things here, at least as far as I'm concerned, is when you're into job enrichment, you're going to give the employee all the tools, resources, if you prefer that word, that he or she needs to do to accomplish the job and then get out of the way. Let the worker do what he or she's supposed to do. Let them know what they're doing. It's a feedback. Doing this right and need to tweak this, whatever it is. And don't make a big deal of them. You don't, bellow it out from the mountaintop. Talk to the employee like he or she's an individual. There are a couple of types of job enrichment. One is job enlargement. That is just taking what used to be more than one task and putting them together. So one person is actually doing what used to be done by two or more. And then job rotation is what it says. Moving the person from job to job to job, that increases his or her importance to the company because now he or she knows more things to do and it becomes more conversant with them and also becomes gains other skills as well. This is another way of motivation, and many of us don't think about this as being motivation, and that is open communication. Most of you made comments about the New Belgium Brewery, and one of the other organizations that's reviewed in the films. They use open communication. People know what's going on, and when they know what's going on, they tend to be more involved. Nobody ought to be unsure of what they do. Every person in an organization ought to know how his or her job helps the company reach its stated goals. Every person, whether it's the janitor or the CEO. Well, there's a lot of ways we can recognize good work. And there's some perks that you give to people, paid time off and things of that nature. I don't know if that's so much recognized as good work or recognized as an individual's ability to do work, and so we reward them for that. This slide just talks about things that help employee morale. By the way, that says remedies for employee moral, and it should be morale with an E on the end of it. Look at the largest ones, open communication. And then what's bad for you on the negative side, the big thing there is lack of open communication. So we ought to figure out that if open communication is good and the lack thereof is bad, we ought to make sure we're communicating with people the way we should. One of the things we have to be cognizant of is when we're managing people across different geographic boundaries, usually would mean different cultures, is people work different. They have different styles and different things in ways. High context culture, which the United States is not, a lot of relationships. In low context, which we are, uh, believe that building relationships detracts from tasks. Now, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about, motivating and working across cultures. Another course I used to teach, I used a case study about an organization sending a Hispanic American or Latino American, whatever the right term is, she lived in Los Angeles. Her parents, I don't know whether she was second generation in the United States, third generation in the United States. Regardless, she'd been brought up in the United States, and so she had a lot of skills. And they sent her to be an HR manager of their Mexican plant. Well, I mean, the thought process was, well, because she has a Mexican background, her parents and grandparents are from Mexico, she'll be able to connect with these people. WRONG. She was not a Mexican, she was an American. And then she goes to a plant or goes to a culture where men don't take orders from women. I mean, somebody should have engaged their brain before they did that. They set this poor woman up for failure. And we have to think about those things. What works in America doesn't always work across the pond. And it's important to know. It's important to know about cultural differences. This is just talking about the differences we still see in the workplace, baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, or millennials, and what they respond to and what they like and what they don't like. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. It is important. They're different. We have to know that. And this talks about best companies for individuals to work for, and there may be other ones. This is a little bit different. Not that the information is dated; it's relatively recent, but of course it could change, and these things change quite frequently. Well, we're at 4:52, and I've exhausted what I want to say about motivating individuals. Now, remember, as I said early on, you or me or anybody else cannot motivate an individual. What we can do is find out what motivates an individual and put those tactics, if you will, in place, hoping the individual will embrace them and motivate him or herself to do a better job. Certainly, we can encourage motivation by letting people know they've done well, by seeing good things and rewarding them simply by a pat on the back. It goes a long way. That's the type of motivation. And yes, people will be motivated, but for two reasons there. Number one, their supervisor, whatever we call that person, has seen what they have done, has recognized them for what they have done, and has passed on some type of reward. Rewards don't always have to have money attached to them to be significant. A simple thank you, which is meant and delivered appropriately, goes a long way. Well, let's take a break to 4:55, and we'll come back and talk about human resources, finding the right people and keeping them. Please come back 4:55. Thank you. All right, 455, we're back. Chapter 11, Human Resource Management, Finding and Retaining the Best Employees. Now let's look at our learning goals for this chapter. Explain the importance of human resource management and describe some of the current issues managing employees. Illustrate the effects of legislation on human resource management. We'll just talk a little bit about that, maybe some of the ones that are more important. Look at the 5 steps or summarize the 5 steps in human resource management planning. Outline the steps in selecting employees. Illustrate employee training and development methods. I want you to remember that training and development are different. They're not the same. We tend to use them interchangeably, and that's not correct. Look at the 6 steps in praising employee performance. And then finally, summarize the objectives of employee compensation programs. And we'll look at pay systems and fringe benefits. This just gives us some idea here. And I'm not going to read this so you can read it for yourself. What this simply is about human resource management is a little bit more than just this, but it's forecasting needs. It's finding employees with the correct skills needed to fill vacancies. Then it is selecting from those people who have applied, selecting the best from those people who have applied. In some respects, developing them, excuse me, I couldn't get that out. We tend not to develop people at lower levels. We tend to train them. We do use some development, but we don't think about development the same way we do with upper management and senior management. I don't mean to say we don't develop them, but we focus more on training at that level and development later. Obviously motivate, but I'm here to tell you human resource management cannot motivate the employee out at his or her workstation. Human resource management can talk about ways to motivate people, but it's got to be up to the direct supervisor who is going to do that. It talks about evaluating and compensating. Human resource management sets compensation rates in accordance with the directives of senior management. They do not actually, for the most part, evaluate performance. That's done by the supervisor, but human resource management creates the systems that are used, and they help people with the technical aspects of that. Human resource management has increased in importance. Large companies now have, and some medium and smaller companies now have a person who is designated as the vice president for human resources, and that person usually sits with the corporate leaders. And of course, laws have changed. There's no question about that, and it's really incumbent upon human resource management folks. And in large companies, they'll have a person who are persons who are dedicated to this to actually keep up with the changes of employment laws to make sure that they're compliant. Figure 11.1, which you can see here, we have graphically displayed, shows human resource management, the many functions of human resource management. It talks here about the legal environment. I guess we could say that, but this is also the work environment because we're talking about recruitment and selection and things of that nature. We have to be cognizant of the fact that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act radically changed the way employers can recruit, select, promote, schedule for training, etc., their employees. And when I use the term radical, I mean that because we didn't do things the way we did it today. And I'm going to use an example here. I was talking to my wife about this last night, and I wish I could remember exactly where I read this, but I can't. There was a study done in the 1920s and 1930s I can't remember who did it or what the purpose of the study was, when they studied black college-educated men who were working as janitors. And the conclusion that they came to, the people that did this, conclusion that they came to was that these people were satisfied in the jobs they were, regardless of their education level. What a bunch of garbage. And I do mean to use that. So when we got to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, specifically Title VII, we radically changed the way people were being selected, promoted, etc. in this country, and it's all for the better. So you can look at this. I'm not going to go into that a great deal more. They use this particular slide, says it a little differently than I do. It talks about developing the firm's ultimate resource. I don't use the word ultimate. I use the word important. I say, or actually the two words. I say that the employee, the human resource, is an organization's most important asset. And so we have to treat them appropriately. And it's very important that people understand that. Too often I keep hearing that, the things that you talk about in your courses not practiced at my workplace. We're still back in the dark ages somewhere. Treat people as humans. You don't treat them like a piece of dirt. It's just not right. And if the employee can't do his or her job, then there are ways to eliminate that employee. But just because that an employee doesn't, your standing in the organization doesn't mean you treat them as a subhuman. That things don't work that way, or they shouldn't work that way. Now, notice here that what this slide starts out with, it says there's a shortage of qualified workers in many areas, and that's quite true. Now, one of the real problems that we have today, and I do mean that, it's not so much this level. We have a great number of people who are being put out of work due to a number of reasons. We can talk about outsourcing, we can talk about a number of things. But one of the reasons that many people are being put out of work is the fact that technology has changed so dramatically and so radically. We can bring that into the workforce and do more with fewer workers. The problem that we have is now we have a number of workers who need retraining, and we're not retraining them. That's not an organization's responsibility. It usually falls to governments and a few other people. But we have to be cognizant of that, because we have to make sure that the people we have in today's workforce and the people who are being displaced because of technology increases will be someplace be able to get the skills so they can come back into the workforce and have the skills that are needed today. We don't have a declining economy any longer. Actually, the number of jobs that have been added to the workforce in the last 24 months has been significant. So we're hiring more workers. One of the things that I read in the New York Times article is even though we're hiring more workers, productivity has not gone up. That's kind of an issue that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm not going to dwell on that, but we are hiring more workers. Yes, we do have increased demands and benefit costs. But after all, if you're looking for the best employee you can possibly get, you're going to compensate that employee well. And a correlation goes to that. If industries are making enormous profits, why can't that be shared with the worker? Now, somebody's going to say, oh, that's socialism. No, it's not socialism. It's rewarding employees just as well as you're rewarding the stockholders, because if you didn't have good employees, the stockholders wouldn't be getting a return. And so we need to think about those things, and we need to change the mindset in places. We want good employees, we have to compensate them. There are a lot of companies that, turn employees over all the time because that's what they do. And we can think of those. We know those. We may even eat lunch in some of those. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about something different here. So yeah, you want good employees, you have to compensate them. This is what I talked about, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and of course it was amended later in 1991. No discrimination based on the list that you see there. And that goes to all facets in employment, hiring, promotion, consideration for training, all sorts of type things. So that's very, very, very important, and we need to think about that and know that and be cognizant of what that says. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was, as it says here, strengthened by the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Program. The EEOC does have jurisdictional duties and does have the right to investigate complaints. And it does have the power of enforcement. And the courts have ruled that Congress did give the EEOC enforcement, and they're not going to step into that because that was by congressional mandate. And so when you hear sometimes people say, well, unelected bureaucrats are making decisions, in many cases they're making decisions because the United States Congress said they could. One thing I want to talk about here, and I don't like to beat this about, it's one of my favorite topics, and I mean that seriously, is affirmative action. And President Johnson brought affirmative action into being because he remembered growing up and the poor choices that many Hispanic Americans had in his area. And the object of affirmative action was to level the playing ground. Now, affirmative action really pertained more to federal contractors and those others doing business with the United States government. Should not an organization have an employment census, if you will, that reflects the area of its operations? Well, yeah, I would think so. It kind of makes sense. And shouldn't you cast an employment a net wide enough that you're going to be able to attract people from all walks of life and find the best of the best? Yeah, that makes sense too. So we're just trying to level the playing field here. Now, the Supreme Court has been whittling away at affirmative action for a period of time. I think we'll see affirmative action changed in the next few years. There was just a court case that they heard, I think it was last year, about a student from Texas who was not admitted to the University of Texas, and she said it was based but the fact that she was not in a protected class. The court sent it back to the lower court to do some more finding and research, et cetera, et cetera. But it essentially said that maybe we need to relook affirmative action and whether it's actually doing what we want it to do. I think it should be retained. I do want to tell you it's not codified in law. It's executive order promulgated by President Johnson in 1965. I don't see anything wrong with leveling the playing field, because in leveling the playing field, the executive order never said and never intended that standards for jobs be lowered simply because somebody was in a protected class. Didn't say that. Never said that, never will say that. And that has been beaten out of whack for too many years, and people have made political hay over things that were never part of the executive order. The Civil Rights Act of 1991 just really kind of enlarged what things that people can do, gave victims of discrimination the right to a jury trial and possible damages, which was not in the 1964 law. I wanted to read that because it's important. And then it instituted the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. That just says that if you're doing business with the government, you have to comply with non-discrimination and affirmative action laws. Of course, you know, or you should know, that we have a number of laws on the books that do protect people in certain classes. Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, 1990. The salient part of that is that employers are required to make reasonable accommodations. They have to have 25 or more employees. The key word is reasonable accommodations. Doesn't say you have to accommodate something. A classic case was a individual applied for a job and had something to do with an assembly line. And he said, well, the only way that he could do the job was if the assembly line was turned around. In other words, instead of running clockwise, it would run counterclockwise. So he sued. And I don't know what court heard the case or what level it heard the case. It's federal court. They said, no, that's not reasonable. You can't ask an organization to change its practices just because you can't be accommodated. That's not a reasonable accommodation. So we have to think about what that says. It doesn't say people have to do things that are out of the ordinary or anything else. It just talks about reasonable. Classic case was up in Connecticut. A woman who was under ADA, and she was actually employed by the city of New Haven in Connecticut. She asked that the shelves, the shelving where she did some filing, be lowered so she didn't have to stand. And they wouldn't do that. That's a reasonable accommodation. It wasn't changing anything. It wasn't changing policies or practices or procedures. They said, can you lower this for me? They said no. Unfortunately, they lost the case and $150,000 and a few other type things. So we have to know what the law is, what it says, and stay abreast of that because the laws constantly change. And the laws constantly change for two reasons. Number one, the Congress might itself change the law, or the Supreme Court or a federal court, other level of federal court, interprets the law a certain way, and it affects certain people. This is the process of human resource planning. And we talked about that in general terms before. They find out the current inventory of employees, do job analyses, see what's going to be needed in the future, assess the local labor market to see if the local labor market can support the demands, the employment demands, and then have a plan to put that to work. This particular slide gives an idea of employee sources, where you're going to find employees. We don't need to go over this. You can see it in your in your textbook, figure 11.4 on page 308. This is where organizations look for employees and try to find employees. Selection is simply, well, I differ with this slide a little bit. Recruiting is getting the information because you have people who are job applicants fill out an application and submit a resume. The selection is going through that information and then holding some interviews, what I call at the beginning a screening interview, that's a weeding out. Then putting that person with a hiring manager, that could again be a weeding out, and then doing all the things that are required. Finally coming down to 2 or 3 candidates now, and then selecting the best of those candidates. Obviously paying attention to, the applicable laws on the books. And what you have to do, making sure that you get complete job applications. An incomplete job application should be rejected. And you do the interviews that we talked about. Employment tests, if those are required. If you do a test, the test has to measure, has to be related to the job. A lot of times the test won't tell you how well an employee will do on a job, but it can tell you that the employee can't do the job. Do background checks, physical exams if that's required, and then probationary period, although many places are getting away from probationary periods. This just says things that employees made mistakes on, or potential employees, things that they shouldn't have done on their job applications. I'm not going to go through with that. Facebook and other online places are ways to find employees, Monster.com and things of that nature. A lot of employers hire contingency workers. Usually they're part-time, seasonal. There's some benefits to that because you don't have to pay Social Security and things of that nature. And there's reasons why they do hire them. Obviously, I mentioned about saving on benefits. And of course, there's also a way of finding out if this person is a good person for a potential hire for full-time work or part-time work. Use students in the workforce, same way. No differences there. One of the things that you have to be careful about is that if you have an intern, interns can do certain things. Now, do not confuse this with an intern, a medical intern. This is entirely different. You have to be careful about giving them responsibilities. You cannot use them as unpaid workers. They have to have specific jobs, and you better make sure that it meets the requirements of an intern. You can get yourself in a lot of trouble using interns inappropriately. We train individuals to do their jobs. And in some cases, we retrain them because equipment's changed, procedures have changed, etc. We develop people to do a next hire job. Notice what it says, focuses on the long term. Do not, as I mentioned early on, confuse the two. They are separate terms. And we do things separately. Training and development. Or anytime you do a developing program, and I want to stay away from training, I want to talk about this more in development, you should have a needs assessment. What is it that the organization needs? What is it that the employee needs? And then design your activities to meet both. Obviously, this is talking about training, and if you're going to do training, you conduct the training, then you go back to the supervisor and say, did the training do what you wanted it to do? And then give feedback to the employees, etc. These are common training activities. Talk about development here. I break these up: orientation and OJT on job training, our training programs. An apprenticeship can be, or it could be, a development program. But things like vestibule training and job simulation probably are talking more about development, even though they talked about training. These are some development type things that you want to do: job coaching, understudy positions, job rotation we talked about before, and things of that nature. And of course, sending people to formal type training, either through college or some other type of organization that runs training. Reasons why employees quit. Notice that the top one is unhappy with management. Networking and mentors are good ways to bring employees along. Mentoring relationship is taking an employee under your wing, usually by someone at a higher level, and that person shows the individual how to overcome barriers and things of that nature. Not circumvent barriers, but overcome barriers. Networking, of course, I think most everybody knows what that is. A performance appraisal simply tells an employee how well he or she is doing based against published standards. An employee has to know what he or she is being rated or evaluated against. There are many different types here. Talk about 360. That's where you get all the people that the employee is involved with: supervisor, peers, subordinates, etc., customers, somebody other to do a rating. A lot of people like that. There's some minuses to it because there's an anonymity built in, and the potential for a gotcha exists. Here's what you have to do. Establish the standards. Make sure the individual knows the standards. You evaluate against the standards. Have a feedback session with the employee where you talk about what was good, what needs to be improved. Focus on the good first, then on what needs to be improved, and you focus on the tasks, not the individual. Take corrective action if you need to. Help the employee do whatever he or she needs to do to improve, and then use the results of the evaluation for management decisions. Some do's and don'ts of appraisals. Don't attack the employee, what I said. Make sure that there's sufficient time. You do it in private. And then obviously stress the positive, and then talk about what needs to be corrected or improved upon. We're going to skip that one. Here are some errors that happen. You have to be cognizant of that. That's a contrast where you're actually comparing one employee to another, although there are performance evaluation systems that do exactly that. Halo or horn effect, you're allowing something that happened recently to affect the overall rating instead of it being across a specified amount of time. And then the similar to me effect is, well, you do things the way I do them, so I'm going to give you a higher rating. Compensation programs are designed to keep and retain the best employees. There are 3 types of pay scales within compensation. A pay scale that lags the market, a pay scale that meets the market, and a pay scale that exceeds the market. You have to know what you're dealing with before you develop that type of system. These are types of pay systems, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the salary. The person is compensated for the amount of work that he or she does, not by hour. And we have the hourly worker. He or she signs a timesheet or has a time clock, and they're paid for the amount of time they work. Piece rate system, exactly that. People are paid for the amount of pieces that they develop, manufacture, if you will. We also have commission plans, bonus plans, profit sharing plans, gain sharing, and stock options. All of them have pluses and minuses. And then there's some skill-based pay we talked about before. Pay is increased as your skill increases. Eastman Chemical uses that. Gain sharing pay is increased as performance increases. And that uses that's across the board. Nucor uses that. And then we have fringe benefits. Fringe benefits can be anything. Can be vacations. It can be paid time off. It can be medical plans, dental plans, etc. It's important to notice that there are more fringe benefits today than there were some years ago. 74% of all full-time workers have employee-provided retirement plans. 39% of part-timers do, and 71% of workers have medical care plans. It can change. We know that. These are some other type of fringe benefits, which I'm not going to go into. It's kind of a laundry list. We have to be concerned about cultural challenges. Benefits are different country by country. They're more generous in Europe than they are in the United States. We have to be careful about the difference in currency. We have to be cognizant of the tax differences and things of that nature. Many companies have gone to flexible scheduling, flex time, which gives the employee a benefit of scheduling his or her hours around designated core hours. Compressed work week. Week is compressed to 4 or even 3 days. And then we have job sharing where 2 employees share what was one full-time job. Home-based work can be difficult. You have to get into this. If somebody offers you home-based and says, we're going to give you the world, you make all kinds of mega bucks, and make sure you do due diligence and check those out and make sure that that's right. Good way to do that is by contacting the Better Business Bureau or Chamber of Commerce in your area to find out if what they say is legitimate. Job sharing just it provides a benefit of 2 or more people having working one job. Yes, it won't be full time, but on the other hand, it may have some benefits. The person doesn't want to work full time, but they do have employment. Always something to be difficult. Difficult and some problematic, and that's rotating employees. If they're promoted or reassigned, promoted means you're going to have a vacancy someplace else, and then somebody, especially if you're doing internal, wasn't selected. So you may have some issues there. Obviously, employees retire, and sometimes employees are terminated. You have to be very careful in those situations. We have to make sure that the employee who is ready to retire is given all the transition information he or she needs, because they're not going to be coming to work any longer. And that may have been their identity. And we have to do the things we can do for them to help them transition to their new stage in life. Terminating employees is never easy. It should be done in private as much as possible. If you're a large enough company, employees should be escorted back to his or her workstation. Everything should be taken from them, passwords, etc., keys, etc., and then also escorted off the company premises. People need to know why they were terminated, and there should be a termination interview. Focus again on what caused the termination, not on the individual. Give the individual a chance to speak. Obviously, you should have another person with you to witness the conversation, and again, do whatever you need to do to get the employee out the door. Not an easy thing to do. Again, people need to know why they were terminated. Stick to the facts and nothing else. Well, we're at 5:27. That brings me to the end of chapter 11. If you have no questions, I'll take a short break and we'll come back and do chapter 12. We'll come back at 5:30, chapter 12, dealing with union and management issues. Thank you. Please come back at 5:30. All right, it's 5:30, Chapter 12, dealing with union and employee management issues. The objectives for this chapter, we're going to look at the history of organized labor in the U.S., look at the major pieces of legislation that affect labor unions, outline the objectives of labor unions, describe the tactics used by both labor and management during conflicts, and look at what might be the role of unions in the future, and then assess some of today's controversial employee management issues such as executive compensation, pay equity, child care, elder care, and then drug testing and violence in the workplace. And really what we're going to do there is actually expose you to those and not do as much discussion on them as it kind of indicates. Unions' main goals are to represent its members in negotiating new contracts and other job-related issues. Unions today are denigrated. Many people don't see the need for unions, but don't realize the contributions that unions have made to the American workforce, whether the individual is a union member or not. Workers' compensation, severance pay, child labor laws, overtime rules, minimum wage laws. And we haven't even discussed vacation. Vacation is a relatively new thing. And labor unions went to management back in the during World War II and said, we understand you can't raise our salaries, but how about giving us some paid time off? And so we have a lot to thank for unions, we workers, and we don't think about that. And all we want to do is denigrate them in many cases and say, well, we don't need them. And many states have gone out of their way to really put unions under their thumb. And I'm not here to talk about politics, but I think we need to look at both sides of the story to make sure that we understand everything that's been done. Are some union leaders corrupt, and have they been corrupt? Absolutely. But we can also ask the same question, have some political leaders been corrupt? Yes. We can't change that story because humans are humans, no matter what side of the management or labor spectrum they follow. Public sector unions have a little bit more clout today than private sector unions. A lot of complaint about that, but we know that they're there. They do collective bargaining. State of Wisconsin went out of its way to emasculate them and did a pretty good job. We'll see what happens if there's a new legislature, and there will be a new governor next time they have a gubernatorial election. This is what the unions strive for. They want to work with fair and competent management. They want to be treated fairly and in a dignified manner. That's the same for all of us. And they want to receive what they consider to be a fair share of a company's profits. And I think that's true with any worker, regardless of whether he or she is unionized or not. Unions have been around a long time. We don't always think about that. The first union in the United States was the craft union known as cordwainers, shoemakers, and it started in 1792. Notice what work hours were in those days, 60 hours a week. That was normally 6 days a week, so that's 10-hour days. Often they got off for Sunday. Sometimes they didn't get off for that. Obviously, wages were low, and there was a lot of child labor. One of the reasons we found unions coming more and more into play was the horrendous fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York. 140 plus women were killed in a fire. I noticed that they were trapped. The door was locked. They couldn't get out. And labor leaders say, all you have to do is look back at that. Well, we've had other ones recently. We've had workers in chicken factories couldn't get out because the doors were locked. We have to stop and think about what's going on here. Those are management practices that should never be tolerated. And we have laws in the books that say that, but on the other hand, many times they're not enforced well at all. The first organized labor union in the United States was the Knights of Labor. Notice that they were formed in 1869. The number of members rose to almost 750,000. But they fell out of favor during the Haymarket riots in Chicago in 1884, I believe that's the correct year. There was a strike going on, and there were protesters, strike protesters and anti-strike protesters at this union rally. Someone threw a Molotov cocktail and 8 police officers were killed in the explosion. There were people rounded up and brought to trial and convicted, although no labor leader was ever actually singled out for having caused this. They were suspected, they were singled out, and some were brought to trial, probably incorrectly. Then we went from them to the AFL, American Federation of Labor, started by Samuel Gompers in 1886. And these were craft union people, going back to people like the cordwainers. And so we think of craft people as being skilled workers. Mostly work with their hands, yes, but they're skilled workers. Then we found, later on, we had what were known as industrial unions. These were made up of people of, notice the term, they're semi-skilled workers. So they weren't from trades, they weren't from certain particular skills, and they weren't in a craft. And people who made up those were the automobile workers, United Mine Workers, and things of that nature. Well, they didn't feel that part of the labor union didn't feel like they were getting a fair shake from the leaders, and so they walked out and formed their own union known as the Congress of Industrial Workers, CIO. And that was run for many years by a gentleman by the name of John L. Lewis, who was also head of the mine workers, but he was very big in the Congress of Industrial organizations. So they split from the AFL in 1935 and then came back to the AFL in 1955. And so we have today's AFL-CIO. And they give you the numbers there of what the current number of unions is and the approximate number of union members in the United States. We have a large number of people in the government unions, perhaps as large, if not larger, than the private unions. We do have to remember that we, the taxpayer, pay those folks. However, we can also ask, do we not want school teachers? Do we not want firefighters? Do we not want police officers? Those people would not have formed a union if they didn't believe that they needed a union, if they were treated fairly. That's one of the things we have to think about, what unions are after, fair treatment. And we just said that early on. So there is strength in numbers, but you wouldn't need that if in fact people were treated the way they ought to be treated. Now, one of the things that it says here, and you'll notice this in the text about a number of labor laws that we have today. We didn't always have those. And for many years, the people who went to work were required to sign yellow dog contracts. And that means that they would do anything, they wouldn't come to work for a union. They wouldn't sign a union pledge card or anything like that. So we had the Norris-LaGuardia Act that actually outlawed that. The Supreme Court even ruled in favor of yellow dog contracts. The unions were not respected for many, many years in the United States. And so we have the Norris-LaGuardia Act and have a few other acts that allowed unions, allowed for collective bargaining, and things of that nature. Collective bargaining is a key issue. It's a key issue whether it's public or private. This tends to be a political issue. And it's only become a political issue in the last few years. Yes, sometimes those unions do things that don't consider the public safety or education of school children very well. We'll hear about teachers that work to the rule, which means they'll work until their time stops and they won't do anything different, things of that nature. And yes, we question that upon occasion. But as I always mention to you, and I want you to consider, there are two sides to the story. And we need to know what both sides of the story are before we can make an adequate or form an adequate opinion. Now, labor unions and elections for labor unions and decertification of labor unions falls to the responsibility of the National Labor Relations Board, created by an act of Congress. And they're set up, the National Labor Relations Board is set up to oversee labor and management issues, which could be disputes, in other words, and then to provide guidelines for a potential union election. In other words, an election to certify a union as the bargaining agent or to decertify a union as the bargaining agent, which we're talking about right here, the next two bullets on this particular slide. The National Labor Relations Board will come in and monitor an election. Well, this is why people join labor unions. Now, the first one it says is there's pro-labor attitudes, and that may be so. But often it really falls to something that comes next, and that's poor management. The climate within the organization is poor. You have bad working conditions. As a matter of fact, one of the things that the labor unions are responsible for is the Organization of Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. A lot of people don't like OSHA because they think OSHA is high-handed and does things that are a little aggravating and things of that nature. Worker safety ought to be paramount for any organization. And it unfortunately, in too many organizations, it's not. And so we have to think about that. Why would you want somebody to work in unsafe conditions? Because those are productivity probably not going to be very good. Yes, some people want unions because they like the union's reputation. And then other people think about unions because it helps promote job security. Now we have things that talk about negotiated labor management agreement. That's the terms and conditions of the contract that was negotiated by labor and management. And then the union security clause, this is important to read, stipulates workers who reap union benefits must either join the union or pay union dues. In other words, the case that was just decided by the Supreme Court, actually it wasn't decided, I'll explain in a second, by someone in California it challenged having to pay union dues. Actually, what happened was that the case was heard by the Supreme Court, but as you know, the current Supreme Court has only 8 members. And so the court split along ideological lines. 4 voted in favor of this person having to pay union dues, and 4 others voted against that. So it went back to the lower court, which had ruled in favor of the state of California, saying that this individual did have to pay union dues. But we can expect that to come back once our case like that, once the court is back to full strength. How much change it'll be, we really don't know. These are the type of agreements that in some cases we have and in some cases we don't have. The closed shop is no longer around. Specified workers had to be members before being hired for a job. That is no longer applicable. Union shop said they don't have to be members, but must agree to join within a specified amount of time. And then an agency shop allows the employer to hire non-union members who don't have to join, but do have to pay union dues. And then the last is, and it's down here at the bottom, it wasn't on that particular slide, and that is the open shop. Notice here, it's voluntary. Union membership is voluntary. Those who don't join a union don't have to pay union dues. And you don't find too many union contracts that have this. Now, we know that there are changes in the automobile industry and the United Auto Workers contracts, and some of that may be in there because there's now a different tier in employment. And I guess I shouldn't have brought that up because I'm really not 100% sure what that says, but there are some differences. And the union did allow, in its last contract, although I understand that they're kind of taking a little bit harder stance, they did allow management to help stave off insolvency and bankruptcy. That allow management to hire a new type of worker who doesn't get the same type of benefits, isn't paid the same rate, paid a lower scale, and eventually that person's upper scale would still be less than the lower scale of seasoned workers, long-time workers, better way to say that. So there are some differences there. Many of the agreements are changing, and they're changing because unions want to protect as many jobs as they can, so they're making some concessions. Sometimes many of the unions feel that the concessions are all one-sided and not really good for the union. Right to work laws, legislation in many states allows workers to get a job without having to belong to a union. That was part of the Taft-Hartley Act signed into law in 1947. I always like to point out that President Truman vetoed that act, but it was overridden by 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress, and therefore it became law. Now, this again talks about the open shop agreement, agreement, and the right to work states it gives the worker the ability to join a union or not join a union if one exists in the workplace, exactly what we pointed out in the previous slide. These are the states that have right to work laws. I think there may be another state added there. I'm not sure. So this may be just a little off. This is what unions do. They try to settle workplace grievances, and they try to settle them at the lowest possible level. And normally what happens is that a grievance says, oh, the management's not abiding by the contract, or they're doing some things that's not written in the contract, et cetera, et cetera. And so the union member will take his or her grievance to the shop steward. and the shop steward is set up. That's what he or she is there for, to represent the employee, a union member, every day. That's part of his or her job. We have a thing that's known as a bargaining zone. By the way, I don't know why they brought this in here, because we should be talking about grievances. I'm going to come back to mediation or arbitration later, because I want to get into the grievance procedure. And you can see the grievance procedure in your text on page 342, figure 12.6. And it just shows what happens here when, I'm going to bring this down just a little bit so it fits on the slide here. And it's not real sharp, but you can see it goes to the grievance from the employee on the one side, the shop steward, and it goes to the next higher person, the business agent for the union, into a grievance committee, then to the national union, and then either to an arbitrator or a mediator. This says arbitrator, and that's probably where it would go. On the other side, you have whoever the supervisor or manager is for management, and then labor relations manager, plant manager, on up the line. These are the tactics used by unions during a conflict: strikes, boycotts, work slowdowns, and pickets. And you can have a combination of all of them going on at the same time. Strike is just simply what it says. The union members won't go to work, and they won't cross a certain line, a boundary line, if you will. Primary boycott is boycotting against the particular organization at which the union is taking a stance against, and saying, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Public, don't buy this company's products. Secondary boycott is when they stop doing business with other firms that are subject of the primary boycott. So convince others to stop doing business with a firm that is subject to the primary boycott. So, don't sell to XYZ, don't ship them materials, et cetera, but we're striking against them. Management uses different tactics. They lock people out. Say, okay, we're just going to lock the doors. You can't come to work if you want to come to work. And many times management will do that before a strike happens. They can go to court and get an injunction ordering workers back to work. However, that doesn't usually happen too often, except in industries that have contracts as national defense contractor or something that directly involves the government. So you don't see that too often. Yes, they do hire strike breakers. We don't hear about that as often today as we used to, but that's still something that they do. They just bring in other workers. And then, of course, that many years ago, that would really precipitate a lot of fights, because the workers were called derisive terms by those in the union. They'd want to cross the picket line, and fights would occur and things of that nature. We don't see that as much as we used to, and that's a good thing. I'm not talking about whether hiring strike breakers is a good thing or a bad thing, but not seeing the violence is certainly a good thing. And of course, this is with this talking about what we just talked about, what a lockout actually is, what an injunction is, and who strike breakers are. Didn't move my slides here. These are challenges that are facing labor unions. That the amount of membership is falling. I don't think it's falling like it was. We do see a lot of other labor unions coming along, and we see some potential for unions to go after white collar workers, especially people like interns and residents in hospitals. And then there was an initiative in one of the western states to unionize teaching assistants at universities. And this is exactly what I talked about. We'll see more white collars in union. We may see some more training from unions, and unions are going to go after more of working to protect people's jobs and things of that nature. This is just union membership by state, which we're not going to talk about. Big issue about executive compensation, especially CEOs. There are many companies now, especially the boards of directors, saying the CEO's compensation should be directly tied to an organization's performance. And while that's an admirable goal, in many cases, CEO contracts are written in such ways that it's very difficult to enforce that. Regardless, CEO pay is, at least as far as I'm concerned, is out of whack. We need to look at it. I'm not denigrating people for what they make, and many of them are certainly compensated well. But what I am saying is that the difference, the gulf between what a CEO makes and what the average rank and file worker makes has grown exponentially. And what happens there when things like that transpire is the relationship between these people has changed dramatically. And it's not just so much superior and subordinate, it's that they can't talk to each other anymore because the culture has changed and is altogether a different dynamic. So something that needs to be thought about and done. I'm not talking about a law or proposing some kind of draconian measures, but somebody has to come up with something that's reasonable. Our CEOs in this country are paid way out of proportion against their Japanese counterparts. College athletes, this has come up, whether they could be unionized or not, that got struck down, but I expect you're going to see that again. And again, there's something on executive compensation. Dodd-Frank Act comes into this. Give shareholders like a person like me, and my wife and I own stock in several companies, more ways to control compensation. There has to be some reason for compensation. Why is an individual compensated at this rate when in fact the company is not doing well? And something has to be thought about. Here's another one, pay equity. I think this is actually a little bit higher. I think women are around 80% of what a man earns today. That doesn't make it right. I think this thing is a little bit higher. We need to think about that and make sure that we do whatever it is we need to do to make sure that pay is equitable. If you're doing the same job, you ought to be paid the same rate. And this is what it should be based on: skill, effort, responsibility, etc. Sexual harassment, unwelcome advances to an individual in the workplace. There are two types of it. One is quid pro quo, simply means you do this for me, I'll do that for you. And then hostile work environment, a little bit different, where the conduct of others creates an atmosphere where a normal person really can't do a good job because he or she's being harassed. We know that child care is becoming a big issue. Many organizations have child care on their premises. Others don't, but that's something that we're going to find more and more of it. One of the issues that's come up about trying to have a living wage is that child care is very expensive, and people working for minimum wage or slightly thereover really have a difficulty of either paying for child care or buying food or something else. We shouldn't put people in that type of situation. Am I going to have to pay more money for a hamburger at McDonald's if they raise the salaries of their individuals, of their employees? Yeah, I probably am. But, you know, in the long-term scheme of things, it isn't going to make that big of a difference. We also have on the other side something known as elder care. Our parents are living longer. We're having to take care of them, and the cost for elder care is expensive, just like it is for child care. We have problems with drugs in the workplace. A serious issue with this. You can see these graphics, the number of people who use illegal drugs on the job, what it costs the U.S. economy, north of $400 billion in lost productivity in healthcare on a yearly basis. And we know that significant numbers of people, of employers, do use drug tests. Notice what OSHA tells us. Homicides account for 16% of deaths in the United States on the job. Significant. We have to be careful about violence. If you work for a large company, you're probably going to have somebody there who's charged with taking care of this. Don't you try to do it. You get those people to come down, or get your friend or cohort, or wherever he or she is, to the right people. And these are some warning signs of people who have a potential to exhibit workplace violence. Be careful. And I'm saying be careful for yourself as well as anybody else. Now I want to go back to the slide about arbitration and mediation and talk about that just for a few seconds, and then we'll conclude tonight's audio and video presentation. All right. I'm not going to talk about the bargaining zone, because the bargaining zone talks about initial starting points for the labor contract. That labor starts with one and management starts with another. But I want to talk about mediators and arbitration. Mediators and arbitrators are different. A mediator is a person who comes in and shuttles between the two sides, and his or her purpose is to keep the sides talking. And he or she tries to facilitate negotiation and to keep the conversation going, as opposed to cutting it off. An arbitrator is somebody who is entirely different. That person is empowered to render a binding decision. The arbitrator has been selected by both parties, both management and labor, and whatever he or she says is the final answer. Now, we find this quite frequently in baseball contracts. There is an arbitrator if there's a dispute and the case goes to arbitration. The player says, I want X dollars, and management and the club says, we're going to offer something less than that. That arbitrator comes in, he hears both sides, and he or she makes a decision, hopefully always based upon the facts, and renders that decision, and that's the end of it. And the problem with arbitration is, and for the most part, is that it causes winners and losers. And so you're going to have somebody who likes it and somebody who doesn't like it. And that can be something that causes bad morale for everyone. So I want to give you the difference between these two people. And by the way, you might notice that there are a lot of companies now that have disputes with their employees, have made them sign that they'll take the dispute to arbitration. The problem with that is that arbitrators, the way it's set up, almost always side with management, and it does not give the employee an even place to stand. And in a number of companies that you deal with, that you sign contracts with, they will embed it in the contract. Will say, if you have a dispute, you have to go to arbitration. I don't know that I agree with that, but if you sign it, that's the way it is. Well, we're at 6:04. We spent about an hour and 50 minutes talking about these three chapters. And we'll be back next week. I normally try to present the 4 chapters on marketing at the same time. Sometimes because of time, I'm not able to do that. So we will definitely do chapters 13, 14, and 15. And time pending, we will do chapter 16 as well. If not, I'll put chapter 16 off till the next week. If you don't have any questions, I thank you for your attendance. Sorry about the confusion for last night, and I'll speak with you again next week. The lecture discussion question is posted both in the forums section and in the coursework assignments section for the week. Thank you and good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.